Hi, welcome to another Flutter video tutorial. Today we're going to be doing starting off a bit of a shorter series of rather than building out a whole app, we're just going to be looking at some very specific small things that are used in most apps that you would build, specifically apps that are going to require some kind of usually an API with it or something like that. This video is going to focus on environment variables as well as local storage. So to get started, I've just created a completely new Flutter project. Not done anything, I just ran Flutter create, and I call this one Flutter env storage, because those are the two topics we're going to be covering. To get started, we are going to be using a new library that I haven't shown you in any of the videos previously. It is called flutter.env. It's a great little package. It allows you to set environment variables for your app so that you can kind of configure different things. For instance, you might want to be able to point to your staging server, development server, production server. You might have different settings for debugging, those kinds of things. And this is just a nice way to control all these things and easily flip between the environments. So what we want to do first off is install this package. So we're going to do flutter pub get, I think we can look at here and see flutter.env or flutter pub add flutter_.env. And it's going to go get us all those wonderful files. Secondly, we're going to go into, we're going to make a new folder called assets right in the root of our directory. And in this directory, we are going to make something called env. And here we're going to make three different files. First, we're going to make .env base, and then .env dev for our dev environment, and then one that's .env prod. Our base is just going to be something that controls which environment we're pointing to. So I'm going to make a key equal to env. Now these are basically just text files. This isn't dark code. It's a configuration file. So we can just write it like that. Capital letters is nice to use for environment variables. And we're going to say dev here. Now there's a few environment variables that I want to cover here, just as examples. So in our dev env, we're going to have something called environment name, and in this case, it's going to be equal to dev. We're going to have a variable of debug, and let's make it true. And we'll make one called API base URL, and we might use something like http://localhost 8000/API as an example. These are just examples. You can configure many other things in here. And then we might also just have maybe one more thing called like pagination size or something. If we wanted to control, how many things we get when we're doing some kind of pagination, which we're not going to be doing in this app, but for example purposes makes sense, and let's just set it to 10. So we have an environment file for our dev. I'm going to copy this, bring it over to our prod file, and just change some things here. So let's make this prod. We're going to make debug false. This would be something, probably more like domain.com/API, and likely your production server will be, HTTPS. So we can do that. And maybe on prod, we actually want to have a larger pagination size. So let's just say 30. Okay, so we've set up just some stuff. Obviously, you can have as many things as you want. Now, keep in mind with environment variables, a lot of times when you think of environment variables, you think, oh, they need to be really secure, they need to be safe, and that's usually true with your server-side code. You don't want to keep those in your repo, and you wouldn't normally version control them. I'd say in a mobile app, you can totally version control this because you shouldn't ever be putting anything sensitive in here anyways. Someone can, because this is a front, an application, someone could, in theory, reverse engineer. Anything you're putting here shouldn't be like a secret key. That's something that would be on your server that people wouldn't be able to access. So it's totally fine to version control these. Alternatively, if you're working with multiple people, you could decide, let's not version control our dev one, for instance, And that way people can kind of make their own settings, and you just have to know what the convention is. So you might make like an .env example and just kind of have that version controlled. Just some small tips for working with environments. Okay, now .env is it's pretty easy to work with, and I'm just going to go into my main.dart to kind of show how you could work with it. So if I type .env here, it's going to import this, and within this, sorry, that imported it, but the actual exposed variable we want to work with is just called .env, like this, I believe. Oh, right, it's called, wait. .env. Oh, it's probably because I'm not in a place that I would be able to write this. env, there we go. Um, the way you essentially work with .env is you can get a key from your env file, but we need a way to essentially load the correct file based on whatever we want. And if we were working with it this way, just right in our code, we could. But if you make a mistake, you're going to have errors. Like you might make a spelling mistake of API base URL or something. So I like to create sort of like a provider to a util function class to essentially manage all this kind of stuff. So let's do that. I'm going to get rid of this import, and I'm just going to do this right in the root because this is going to be a really small app, but likely you would make a folder maybe called utils, and then inside there have something called environment. So let's make a new file, and I'm just going to call this env.dart. Okay, in here we're going to create a class, and it's going to be just called env. And this class, we're only going to work with it in a static sense. So we're not actually going to create like an instance of our env. It's just going to be something that you can always grab things from just by calling it, which will make more sense in a bit. But we do need a way to initialize this. So I'm going to make a static function called init. It's going to be asynchronous. And what we want to do is essentially load, first of all, we want to load that file called env base, okay? And that's because we need to know what file, in this case, what environment we're working with, dev in this case. So we're going to do an await, and we can use .env, and that should auto import for us. So await.env .load, and we want to load with a file name of, and this is stored in our assets directory /env /.env base. All right, then in order to do this now, if we were to run this now and actually try and invoke this, we will get an error. It's not going to be able to find this file, and that's because things in your assets folder don't just automatically become part of your app. You do need to go into your pub spec, and you'll see down in the assets area here, where is it? There's sort of an example. You can comment this out, and we can actually just type assets /env/, and I'll get rid of this one. And that will load everything in the assets env folder when the app's compiled. So we made a change here, did a little pub get, all should be good. Okay, so we'll keep that as it is right now. I'm going to go back to my main.dart just so we can start kind of working with this. And we're going to make our main function asynchronous just to make this easier to work with. And we're going to go await env, and that should just auto load our env.init. So now if we reload here, let's see if we have any errors. No, everything is looking good. Okay. So what I want to do first, just to help other developers, making sure that you didn't make a typo, all that kind of stuff, is let's just write an assert right here. This is kind of a way that when this app builds, it can make sure that this stuff is true, and we want to make sure that the .env.env, so the environment, contains a key called env. That's what we're expecting this file to have. If it doesn't, nothing after this is going to work. So we'll save, we'll refresh, and let's just do a test. Let's change this to env1, for instance, and refresh. And we will see that this sort of error happened. Unhandled exception, failed dissertation, da 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 da. So that's just a good, putting that there just means, we're not going to have any issues like we have this issue, but it alerts us very much. So let's put that back to just env, and we will go back here. Okay, so now that we have that, what I want to do is, we don't really care about the contents of this file other than the fact to tell us which one, in this case, we want to be pointing to when we do a build. So I'm going to do await.env.load. So similar to what we were doing before, file name. And then what we're going to do is we want to point to assets/env /.env underscore, and then it's going to be the name of whatever was in here. Now, in order to get that, let's just make a variable called env name. You can call this whatever you want. And to get that, we actually go .env.env, and we can go like this and go env. And luckily, we can just do that. So this is going to take whatever that name is, and essentially actually then replace whatever we've imported with this. So the idea here is anytime you want to change environments, you could just go in here and change this to prod, for instance, rebuild, and you'll have your new environment settings. Okay. Then what's good to do is there's going to be certain things for sure in your environment that are required. So if we look at our dev, having an environment name, our application might really care about having that. Whereas something like debug, maybe that's not a required field, and we have a default setting. API base URL, that's something that you're going to want to have. So what we can do is we can do a couple more certs here just to make sure there weren't any logical errors when creating that env file. So I'm going to assert that our .env.contains key. I definitely want to make sure that whatever file we're loading, there's an API base URL. And similarly, we'll just copy and paste that and make sure that environment name is in there. Those are the two that I care about. I think the rest we could just kind of set a default for when it doesn't exist. So this is our init function. Now, like I said, in our code, and I will show this to you right now. Let's actually do something here. This isn't the way I actually want to do it, but I'm just showing you how you could work with .env. We can go .env, env, and then I could paste in what's one of our keys. Let's just do the environment name. And this needs to be obviously wrapped in text. And then can't be because it's a string. No safety stuff, sorry. Let's just, maybe I can solve it like this. Title, oh wait, is title not a text field? I think this is actually correct. Okay, so we're basically we're gonna make the title, the environment name. Let's see if it's restarted. Oh, right. That title doesn't actually show up in the app. Let's do this somewhere else. Let's use this right here. That's the Flutter demo homepage. There we go. So this is one way we could work with it. And this is kind of like the expected way that, the docs kind of say to use, just, this and then this thing. But this creates tons of room for error, right? Because you could, forget to put this semicolon here or this underscore there. And if we were to refresh, it didn't actually get it. Also, if we wanted to have environment variables that weren't strings, we'd have to, every time we use them, convert it to, if it's an integer or a Boolean, convert it in our code in many places. It can get really cumbersome. So what we will be doing instead, and I'm just going to undo, we'll keep it there for reference. Let's just save that again. So we have our dev. What I would like to do is actually create sort of some getters in this env file that will return that for us. That way we can have our IntelliSense and autocomplete and stuff like that. And I'll show you what I mean. So I want to make a static function because we're only going to work with this class statically. And it's going to return a string, but it'll be an optional string. It might return null. And it's going to be a getter, so we'll use get, and we'll just call this environment name in the normal, camel case that Dart likes. And here we will return .env environment name. And I can just copy and paste this here. Now, we know that this will never actually be null because we're doing an assert that will basically crash our entire app anyways if this doesn't exist. But VS Code isn't smart enough to know. So either we have to make it a string like that, or we could just decide to return a default. I'll just go with this way. It doesn't really matter. So what we can do now is instead of calling it like we were doing here, we can grab we can go env and auto import that dot, and look, we're getting some IntelliSense here. Environment name, yeah, cool. So that allows us just to work with this a lot easier throughout our code. And if our key ever changed, we change it just in one spot. We're not going and searching and finding, replacing through our whole code base. So just to show you how to flip environments, it's really easy. So we have a dev environment. We also have a prod environment. If I go in my base and change this to prod, and for this, anytime you are changing your environment, you will have to do a green arrow refresh, not just a hot reload. And you're going to see here that this changed to prod. So it's actually capturing, because of the way we've done this, looking for that file name and loading that file name. Everything is good. And let's just turn it back to dev. So these are obviously really simple examples, but I think you can see the power of having different environments, pointing to different servers or having like debug modes for developers, that kind of thing. Let's make a few more things to conform with what we are doing. So I'm just going to copy this one because it's going to be very similar. And we'll call this API base URL. And we already know that. So we can have that one too. And let's start, instead of just putting this in this code here, I'm going to clean up this file and just kind of get rid of some stuff here. I'm just going to make this a container for now. Actually, sorry, a scaffold. And I'm going to get rid of this whole homepage class. This is just the stuff that comes with when you do a Flutter create. Let's give this an app bar, title, text, and we will call it Flutter env env / storage. There we go. Okay, now in order to see our variables, we were kind of putting the title, but let's actually make something that shows it a little more, a little bit better. So let's do a body within our scaffold. And inside here, I think we want a container. Actually, let's do a padding. Padding edge insets dot all of 8.0, and we can make that a constant. So there we go. And then the padding child will be a column. And let's just put text in here and let's just write something like environment name, just like this. And then we can use our string interpolation here to go env, which we've already imported, dot environment name. And let's do that here too, to API base URL, and we'll just replace this. And there we have our lovely things being switched. Just because it kind of looks awkward, let's just make the the cross-axis alignment dot stretch, just so it goes full width. There we go, and it doesn't do that weird centering thing. So there we have that. And similarly, if we were to then change this to prod and refresh, we get those different settings. Awesome. Let's try to change it to something that doesn't exist, like stage, and refresh. And we will get this big error here. And that's because we did that assert on making sure, or that's because that file doesn't exist, which is fine, because this will never make it, you won't be able to build this and deploy this app because you'll have that build error. So we are protecting it fairly well. Back to dev, refresh, everything's clean again. Okay, let's make a couple more things, and we'll take these ones a little bit further. So for instance, we have a variable called debug, but everything in this environment is always going to be a string. But because we kind of have this shim that we're building to work with it, we can still, we can still return a bool. So we'll call this debug, and we can go return.env .env debug, that's the name of our key, equals true. And basically what this will do is it's going to, this is like an if statement. If .env debug is equal to true, return true. Otherwise, if it's anything else, it's going to return false. So that's how we can deal with a Boolean one, which is really nice. And to just show this in action, let's just go debug. And now if I was just to do this, we will see debug true. Now, it's a little bit confusing because it looks like it's actually pulling that, but this is a Boolean, so we can actually go, something like this. Yes, no. So this is just a ternary expression being like if environment.debug equals true, write the word yes, otherwise write no. So we are actually working with a Boolean variable here. Similarly, we could have an integer. So I'll copy this and let's call it pagination size. And in our environment, we called it pagination size, so we'll copy that. Now, we won't be returning a bool here, we will be returning an int. So what we can do is, see, it's expecting to be a string. This error is saying string cannot be returned to pagination size because of return type of int. So we can go int.parse, and we can just parse whatever's in here. Now, because this technically can be null for many reasons, we do need to kind of add a default here. And let's do that. Let's have a default of 10. Now, the interesting thing is I can't actually write 10 like that. I have to do 10 as a string because we're parsing, and we're parsing a string. When you do int.parse, it's expecting a string. So I can actually do this, and this will get turned, if pagination size isn't set, this will get turned into 10. Actually, let's make the default 5 just so we can show a cool example. And back here, I'll copy this one, and we'll call this pagination size. And we can go pagination size. See, we get that autocomplete. It just makes it a lot easier to work with. Okay, so there we go. We're getting 10. Now, what if we omitted from our dev this entire key? We didn't set it as something, we're not asserting to make sure it exists. So if we refresh now, we're actually going to see it's 5, and that's because we've just set a default right in our environment. So that works great. It allows you to kind of have settings that are required by just asserting them here, and then settings that are optional by setting something here. Same with debug. Technically, debug will only be true if it says true. So if we were to in our dev omit debug, right now it's saying debug yes. If we actually admit it, we're going to say debug is no, which makes sense. If you don't actually specifically say I want this to debug, it should be like that. Also, if you put debug to something that is not true, you made a mistake, you typed true wrong, that kind of thing, it's still going to say debug no. The only way to get debug mode is to actually type true. You could, of course, do 1 or 0 or any of that kind of thing, as long as your environment, is, you built it to make sense. So there we go, debug mode, pagination size 5, all that kind of stuff. And similarly, if we go back here and change this to prod, we should see all these settings magically change. Prod, debug no, pagination size 30. So that's basically it for environment. As a quick review, all we've really done is installed that one package to work with this called flutter.env. We made sure we included that assets, and we created 3 files. Then in here, well, this is just us printing the stuff up by loading in env, which is the file we made, and just calling these. And then in here, we load the file that tells us what env we want to point to, and then we load that file based on that. We assert a couple things just to make sure that there's not going to be any problems, basically what we think should be a required field. And then we created some getters just to grab those so that we don't make typos throughout our app. It's all in one spot. If that key changed, we could change it. If we want to do something like, always make our environment name lowercase, we could decide to do that just here and it'll happen everywhere else. All that kind of exciting stuff. So there we go. That's kind of like the part 1. Going right into part 2 now, we are going to talk about storage.